So, welcome to the next edition of the Rare Business Podcast. With me today, I have Tim Deeson of Deeson, who will explain exactly what they do in a moment. But hi, Tim, how are you doing?
Very good, thank you. Yeah.
And so, Tim, I know there's an interesting story or backstory to Deeson, and where you've come from and where you are now. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about Deeson, its backstory, and sort of the work that you do right now.
Yeah, so I started Deeson, the digital agency part of the company back in 2001, and Deeson, the legal entity in the company, had actually been started by my granddad in the 50s in London. So
okay.
He was a writer and publisher, and he was doing kind of PR and kind of content. It wasn't called content creation work then.
Actually writing.
Yeah, exactly. We just called it writing, I think, then, and books and journals. And then my dad in the 80s had started a contract publishing part of the business, and had kind of taken over from him. And in 2001, I'd been working for Debenhams wedding gift service, been backpacking, come back, was about to go to uni, and some of the clients of the business wanted websites building, because it was 2001 and everyone wanted a website at that point. And I'd been lucky enough to be taught some kind of programming skills and things by a family friend when I was quite young, and I was like, well, I could go back to Debenhams, and I was probably earning about £3.10 an hour or something then, or I could do some kind of contracting for the company, do this for a few months and head off to uni. Started kind of making some websites. I was also building kind of a CRM tool, a really early kind of CRM tool for them to use as a company at the time. And it just kind of dawned on me, really, I was quite enjoying this, and it was something that I thought, well, I could actually be doing something quite interesting and earning some money right now, and I'm not really that motivated to kind of to do uni. So I kind of deferred my place, and that was really how the agency started. So there was a contract publishing part, and effectively kind of alongside it, this digital agency accidentally kind of started growing out on the side.
So is the university place still deferred?
I did, in the end, I did Open University. After the company had been running for, I was probably like mid to late 20s at that point, I did, for 4 or 5 years, I did Open University. So I did a systems thinking, economics, software engineering, kind of an American style modular degree,
right.
Which was trying to kind of, I think partly I wanted to do it for my own. I felt like I would have missed out on something if I hadn't done it, I guess. And actually, I was genuinely really passionate and interested in the topics when I got going on them, and it did give me a kind of formal or structural perspective on a load of things I was experiencing in the workplace. Basically, it was an interesting kind of tie. There was definitely points where it had been a really long week, and I was then spending Saturday writing essays kind of through gritted teeth. But
yeah, I have a friend of mine that's going through kind of a similar sort of thing, but I think he is a addicted learner, and he's sort of kind of like, oh, I'm going to do that and do another course, and you just kind of go, oh. I admire his commitment and discipline.
Yeah, I think it helps a lot if you enjoy the subject. I could not have done it because I thought I should have done it. I was genuinely, luckily enjoying the content, and I found Open University had incredible teaching materials, so that was what I think dragged me through the dark points of.
So one of the things that I'm interested, as you know, in service and experience and organisations that do kind of good things in that sort of space, but also all the things that are sort of facilitating that. And one of the things and one of the sort of trends I'm seeing is that there's a large move towards companies moving towards, I feel like, a more flexible, adaptable, agile way of kind of working, and particularly and one of the things that's particularly kind of showing up in that is this idea of sort of self-organising kind of teams, and that's kind of quite relevant for you guys. So can you explain how your business is now currently organised?
So we've gone through a few evolutions. I guess we've both grown in size, which has determined our kind of organisational structure at different points because what's been appropriate, but we've also kind of evolved our understanding, I guess, of what form of self-organising teams kind of suits us. So we are kind of on a late stage. We took the Spotify pod model, And so we have things like chapters, for example. There were other aspects of that because we're a service business, we're a digital agency, we create and deliver projects for clients. We don't have a product. We found that some aspects of the Spotify model was too orientated towards a long-term product focus. Yeah. So we're kind of on a kind of an evolved Spotify. So we have some hierarchy and structure, but we took the principle of minimizing that as much as possible, being as kind of radically transparent as we possibly can, and allowing kind of and minimizing the hierarchy. So in terms of people being able to engage in initiatives from anywhere in the business and rallying people around that. So we had a zero hierarchy, full self-organising as far as we could, and we found that both wasn't desirable for possibly anyone involved, and certainly wasn't getting the results that we'd hoped for.
Okay. And why the change from a more traditional organisation? Sorry, because we were talking before, and it seemed to me there was a specific sort of moment that sort of provided the rationale, or a period that provided the rationale for the change, and that'd be interesting to if you can explain kind of that.
Yeah. So I think the digital agency had reached probably about 10 or 15 people, and I was managing director, I think, at that point across the whole company, and certainly very involved in. My dad was running the kind of publishing day-to-day business, but I was certainly running the entirety of the agency business, and I was the kind of centre hub, I guess, so I was acting in a very kind of directional way. I would deal with new business, I would be accountable for the projects, the line management, and I was, very naive. I'd had some management experience when I'd been working at Debenhams, but really I'd never worked in an agency before, I'd never run an agency before, so we were bumping our head up against the first breaking point, basically, of how do we add hierarchy to the agency, like what roles will we add? Now Tim is completely failing in kind of capacity and imagination, I guess, of what does management mean here, and I was kind of instinctively, it felt I wasn't really sure how to, and it didn't really feel kind of intuitively right to me to start kind of adding people on top of the people I was already working with to tell them what to do. There was a kind of an instinct to say, actually, people here are motivated to do a great job and are passionate. There's a kind of intrinsic motivation thing that I thought we're going to really break if I just start hiring managers to point fingers at people. It didn't feel like just adding a kind of a hierarchy was the answer at that point.
And was there an element that there were not people within the organisation that wanted to sort of step up because they were happy just doing the work they were doing, and then also there's this other kind of element that there's a risk that if you bring other people from the outside, then it creates a different dynamic and it changes to the culture and all that sort of stuff. Is that an element as well?
I think both of those factors played into it. I think we had people who were great kind of digital practitioners but weren't particularly keen or interested in developing into management. I don't think I had the insight or ability to help people kind of develop into management roles, and certainly the thought of kind of bringing in managers just felt a bit weird and wrong and odd, I guess. I don't think I'd had experience of doing it, and the thought of bringing in strangers to tell people what to do when we're already doing there's some really great stuff we're doing just felt like a risky, complicated thing to add.
So, would you characterise your approach as being, because there's all sorts of people like labels. We all like labels.
Yeah.
So would you characterise your approach as being agile, is it democratic, is it holacracy, is it flat, empowered, systems thinking, etc., inspired, or is it a stew?
We tried... I love labels because they're clear. That I think at certain points I wanted to, buy the textbook of a certain model, apply the textbook, and walk away happily into the sunset, and that would be the end of it. And what I found was we looked deeply at things like holacracy, and we looked, very deeply at the Spotify model, and did go a long way into integrating that. What I found was that in reality, there's all sorts of nuance and contextual kind of issues, and the change management that means that none of those labels. I haven't seen anywhere, and I don't really believe in that you can just take one of those labels off the shelf and do a kind of a 4-week kind
sticker.
of sticker it on and kind of walk away. So I guess what we evolved towards, I think, was understanding the principles that mattered to us a lot more, and really kind of really working out how we would best deliver and kind of enshrine those. So things like intrinsic motivation, like working out what people really, really want to do and making sure we get out of the way of that as much as possible. So we did things like distributed and flexible working. So with a couple of caveats, people can work whenever and wherever they want, because if they're not motivated to do a great job, we don't think that forcing them to sit in the office 9 to 5 is really going to have much impact on how great a job they do.
So it's all about it's all about delivery and outcomes rather than being about sort of, you know, a bit like being a farmer, sort of like having kind of sheep in a field and going 1, 2, 3, 50, yeah, I'm good.
Exactly.
And the next day 1, 2, 3, 50, yeah, I'm good. And then nothing's all is well with the world, sort of thing.
Yeah. So really that kind of empowerment aspect and we push people hard, and we definitely there's people we don't hire for a reason, or people who don't flourish in our environment, because we also push accountability for results and accountability for personal effectiveness quite hard. And we say we're giving you the freedoms and we'll give you the tools, and we'll make sure we do our very best to provide inspiration and purpose. But ultimately, we completely recognise you're an adult. If you are going to succeed or not, really, that's going to be your decision. Ultimately, we're not here to tell you what to do on a minute-to-minute, day-to-day basis.
So that just made me think about two questions. First of all, what are the principles that you came up to? The distributed.
So distributed and flexible. So kind of when and where you're working. Mm-hmm. You might be a morning person. You might be an evening person. Right. You might have a lifestyle that means that you have childcare responsibilities, or all sorts of. We all live these different lives, and rather than if we set kind of goals to achieve and outcomes we want, then I have far more confidence in people being able to run their lives as a way that helps us achieve those outcomes than me telling people when and where they need to go and do those things, because it's knowledge work. Right. It isn't. We can't measure what people are producing or the kind of absolute quality of it. It's not a factory, and running things in a way which treats us as a kind of a presenteeism model and a kind of forced kind of structured collaboration model. It just doesn't work that way. There's designers, there's developers, there's user experience people, there's creative directors. They, how long they sit at a desk, because in my experience, a very poor, kind of ratio of how amazing the work is that they produce.
And so, is that the only principle? What other principles are there?
Yeah, I mean, we don't. I haven't kind of recently kind of articulated them in a kind of a very structured. These are the 5 things, I guess. I mean, certainly the kind of autonomy, the intrinsic motivation, that the kind of setting out vision and goal is critical, and we need to challenge ourselves as a leadership team constantly to do better at that, rather than be worrying about the kind of the cold-faced micromanagement. Because most of those problems go away when you can look at the big. You can demonstrate to people the big picture and why it's beneficial to them and to the company. And certainly things like the empowerment, transparency. So if at all possible within the company, if there's a reason, unless there's a really good reason why people shouldn't have access to something or know something, then we make sure that all of the information is as open as possible. And there's obviously things like there's both legal issues or privacy issues or personal kind of protection issues why that isn't why we protect some of those things. But one thing I think is an interesting point there. One thing we did find was that the just kind of everything being available to everyone is a kind of default transparency move I think that people make. What we really quickly learned is people don't have time to sift through all of the documents all of the time. That's not really effective transparency. Effective transparency is also packaging things and making them available in a format and a time and a place that means people can actually engage with them, rather than saying, well, everyone's got access to our 100 pages of financial reports we produce every month, therefore we're transparent. And at one level you are, but what you haven't done is engage people with whether that's the financial reality, the strategy reality, or whatever the thing is that you want people to really own or feel they have insight into.
The thing about transparency, I find that the question I always have about that is that it's like, how much attention do people actually kind of pay to it? And is it that they go, actually, we don't really need to pay attention to it, but we just like to know that we've got it? Is that been your experience sort of thing? Because almost you can put things up and people go, oh, it's too much, and they get on with their daily kind of work, but they just like to know that it's there if they want to access to it, rather than it being all kind of hidden and a bit black box.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's more nuanced in reality, as you say, because a lot of the, for lots of people, the details of what our financial performance is, or the details of how we're doing our ISO accreditation or something, it's just not particularly interesting or relevant to them. And they don't have the capacity to. None of us within the business have the capacity to know all things all the time. So for me, it's much more. It can sometimes be transparency around decisions or planning. So if there's going to be a difficult decision, or we're doing planning that really may have an effect on a lot of people, or we think there's an issue that people are going to feel strongly about, I think it's about trying to bring those things up as early and as clearly as possible, because what you're doing when you do that is you're building up, you can kind of, I think someone once referred to it as kind of a trust battery or a trust bank or something, like when you consistently behave and operate in a way that people can see that you've done the hard things around transparency. When it comes to those difficult decisions, they're going to say, look, I may not like this, but I can understand why this has happened. And because you've consistently been able to share the kind of background of things, rather than what I think it can be tempting to do in senior terms is sometimes kind of give the kind of the show version of a decision, or the kind of the press release version of this is what we're doing next. And the problem is people quickly work out what the reality is. So the next time you kind of come and say, we're going over here for this reason, and 3 months later it turns out you were doing that actually because there was poor profit or poor performance or something else, rather than it being a genius strategic move. You're slowly just eroding people's interest in listening to what you say.
Well, yeah, I mean, it also occurs to me if you think about it from a customer and service perspective, it's a bit like there's this idea, or there's a general fear when people talk about offering a money-back guarantee, and all of a sudden you'll have a camp, and it's generally the majority camp, they go, oh, then everybody will come back and want their money back. And then that's the thing, the fear of, if you like, the improbable is the thing that stops them kind of doing it. But actually in reality, most people just see that as just being, it's like a trust indicator. It's like, we believe in what we're doing and we're going to work really hard, and if you don't like it, we'll give you your money back. I mean, ultimately, you sort of, most customers are protected in that sort of way anyway. So it's just an interesting, this is sort of the psychology kind of behind it.
Yeah, and I believe what you can't pick is to have no problems. What you can pick to some extent is the problems you have, and sometimes it is a very difficult conversation or a very difficult situation. But what you can choose is, I guess, how you engage with that, and whether your kind of difficulty in that situation is going to be a lack of trust, which is going to erode a load of other issues, or whether your difficulty is going to actually just be that you're in a very uncomfortable position, having to have a candid conversation, but off the back of that there is at least a common understanding of where that came from and where it will be going.
Yeah. So let's go back to Deeson and this kind of move to self-organising kind of teams. I mean, so how do you actually get started? Did you get started with articulating that this is what the challenge is and this is what we believe you want to kind of move towards, or how the nuts and bolts of it? That's the thing that's really interesting, because like it all sounds very well.
Yeah. No, it's been a painful process with lots of things, with lots of experiments that have failed and some that have succeeded, and it's definitely been an evolutionary process. I don't believe, if you look at this in change management terms or culture terms or communication terms, I don't believe it's just something you do once or that you can do to other people, and there's an interesting thing there around self-management generally, of how if a leadership team wants a company to self-manage, is it even conceptually correct that they can then become a self-managing company without the consent and engagement of those those team members? I think and what looks like a label versus a reality, I think again will kind of be different. So for us, I think we started to take some baby steps. I think we recognised we were in a very competitive recruitment environment. We recognised as we grew we were going to be making choices about the type of company we were, the type of management team maybe we were going to have to hire, the type of policies and processes that we were having to start to define as we grew. So this is probably around the 20 people mark maybe, and I think the first thing we did was about distributed and flexible. So we said, actually, we're going to have core hours now between 11 and 3, but other than that you can work whenever you want. And I think we said you can work up to X days per week from home. And for us, that was it was definitely a shift, because we'd come from a very, you must be here a minimum of 9 to 5, and unless there's a kind of welfare issue, you must be in the office. And that was our first kind of step towards, we care about the results you produce. We really don't think we're the best bits, not a good use of either of our time to try and understand in too much detail how you get there.
Yeah, because it's interesting that when I recently spoke to Andrew Lawson at Zopa, and they had their organisation's, I think it is larger than yours, but they started on this kind of process around October 2015 or something, and as of the beginning of January, first day back to work on January 2016, they just went boff, right, we're straight into this new kind of system, everybody's got new roles and organisation and so on and so forth. And what was kind of fascinating is almost that they said they believed that if they were going to do it, they had to go all in. They just went, push all the chips in. We have to do it they believed that they had to do it. There was almost a short shock, and it just had to. They did a big communication program and consulted lots of people and got lots of people involved, but just went boff, bang, we're in. But the results has been tremendous. They delivered more in the first quarter of 2016 than they did in all of 2015, and there was some facilitating stuff that supported that. But it's interesting that you said you've done it a bit more kind of gradually and sort of around some of these kind of principles.
I think, and partly that was, I think we hadn't determined a model that I think we were working very much on intuition and principles then, rather than, I'm not sure I was aware, or whether holacracy existed at that point. Certainly, I don't think I was aware of it. So I think there was a lack of kind of knowledge of there may be a kind of model we could just introduce. And I think there was probably also, it was an experiment. I don't know if we would have had the confidence to kind of say this is the leap we're going to make.
How long have you been going at this sort of?
So it's probably about 3.5 years or so.
Okay.
Yeah, and through these kind of different evolutions, and we're coming up to 40 people now. So we've seen organisational growth of between, or revenue growth of between like 15 and 30% in the years between then. So for us, commercially, it has worked. There has definitely been points where we've had missteps, we've had organisational growth pains, but we've had, I guess, because there's been multiple threads of things happening, some of it we've had to learn and grow, and we've tripped up, possibly not because of self-organising, to be honest, but because of other kind of factors happening with the business.
Has it allowed you to scale kind of a bit easier?
Yeah, I think it's allowed us to have a culture that probably that stands for something and that attracts people. I think of a certain because recruitment and retention is a real challenge. Tech is an incredibly competitive. There's a lot more than people want from just a certain thing to be able to use a technology, or there's a package really of what people are looking for.
Sure.
And I think that's kind of helped. And I think also we're at the point now where there's a leadership team and a growth team who are looking at what's our 3-year plan as a business, and there is no way we will deliver the growth that we're looking to deliver without being able to harness more and more energy and passion from more and more of the business, and that will only happen through people being able to or wanting to be deeply engaged, I guess.
I must say, just for people that are listening, and I'll include a link in the highlights as well, is that Tim and his colleagues at Deeson have been incredibly generous by actually making all of their handbook and their story kind of freely available to everybody. So I'll make sure I get all that kind of linked up, because it was written up as a blog post, and it's evolved into this kind of this handbook thing that's freely open and available on the website. I'll make sure everybody gets pointed at that, so you can pilfer away. Kind of, it's an organic document, but that'd be very, very useful. But the interesting thing I think about that is that you talk about it's a competitive environment, but does this type of scenario, this type of organizational sort of structure, does it lend itself to the more experienced sort of professionals, sort of who understand the what they're about and how they prefer to work, rather than being somebody who's a bit green behind the ears, as it were?
Yeah, and I think that is one of the. I think it's really, when you look at kind of organisational design and organisational structure, I think the organisational stage of maturity you're at, the context that you're operating within. What do you want to? Do you value innovation over stability or kind of certainty? I think it's really important that there is no one size fits all, and there is no one good kind of model. And I think really one of the challenges I think of self-organising and things like distributed and flexible is that often I've certainly seen the more experienced the team member is, the more likely they are to both benefit from it and I think recognise the benefits of it, if that makes sense. So if it's your first job after uni, to be honest, you've never worked in a large corporation where you felt like employee number 7,432. You've never worked in a tiny startup where maybe it's both exciting and chaotic, so I think there's something about probably a bit about life stage and a little bit about also having experienced the kind of pros and cons of different contexts where people and also from how we support people as an organisation is the risk with self-organising is if it's all about intelligently pulling things towards you, if you don't have the experience, if you don't know what you don't know about your practice or your capabilities, and that was certainly something there's a real risk there. So there's certainly something we lost, is I completely failed to understand the difference between management and leadership and coaching and mentoring, and so we'd kind of swept away all management, all leadership, all coaching and all mentoring in one kind of fell swoop and said we're very flat, we're self-organising, and people will pull success and their kind of needs towards them, and that was just completely incorrect. Obviously, leadership around vision and setting the tone of what do we do and how do we do it, and certainly for more junior people needing the support of a senior colleague to say these are things that you're not aware of that you might need to know or might need to develop as behaviours, for example. So I think that can kind of get sometimes in a purist way or in a kind of from a distance, the understanding of what organisational jobs to be done there are isn't always kind of great, and I think it can kind of end up feeling very kind of mechanistic, or these are just units kind of operating, and actually organisations have they do a lot of different there's a lot of implicit jobs that hierarchy can sometimes more naturally do when it works well, that you have to make sure you still find a way to deliver.
So let me come back to that, because the thing that when you were speaking the idea about sort of if like younger people that are less experienced, does that propose a business challenge for yourselves in terms of talent identification and development, in terms of how the business brings through younger kind of sources and brings through the business the younger talent, or is that just a limiting kind of part of the kind of the model, or is that's almost at the next derivation that you've got to figure out how do we kind of accommodate those kind of challenges?
Yeah, I think it's
like building an academy of some sort.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's depending on your size and your kind of staff turnover and your growth needs and the kind of the recruitment market that you're in. I think it's definitely, there's something about one office or many floors of an office where everyone comes, and I think for the more for people in an earlier stage of their career, there's a lot of value in having a physical environment with lots of contact with lots of peers that can be really beneficial. And if you have things like distributed and flexible, so we have 2 offices, and we also have people who don't work from offices in 2 different locations in the UK, then you can start to break apart your ability to support maybe those new graduate schemes, and then you have to think about how do we create an academy, or how do we serve some of those needs and attract some of that talent, because we've removed our traditional kind of proposition to those people.
Sure. And then going back to what you were saying, you sort of alluded to earlier on, is that and this is something we talked about sort of previously, is this that you mentioned that this idea of being mechanistic, and that actually self-organising teams is a concept and a structure can lack sort of that social and emotional intelligence sort of element to that. So, what have you done to try and can you explain a bit more about that? What have you done to try and compensate, for that? Because it's like, I go back to the conversation I had with Andrew at Zopa. He kind of said that actually that's one of the things that showed up for them, is like, and they said, we were so surprised when you put all these people together and you just expect them to get on and do the work, sort of thing, that we forgot to got to pay attention to the fact that they're all very, very different people coming from very, very different backgrounds and have very, very different styles, and it becomes this hadron collider of sort of stuff, and they had to invest really heavily in people management, communication sort of skills. I mean, is that you have the same sort of experience?
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting, because I think my first pass in this kind of purist, and I came, most from an engineering background, I guess. I think for me, this kind of self-organising model was that the system takes care of all needs, I guess. The system, you just drop people into it, and the system is the thing that understands and makes sure all of these different needs are met. And it's interesting, what you were saying Andrew was adding, because in some ways he was adding what all organisations need. However, you decided to do your kind of organisational design and people management, the kind of actually good people managers, I don't believe you can. They're incredibly, incredibly important, incredibly powerful, and I haven't seen a system yet that really makes any credible claim to that need not really kind of existing.
Sure.
And I think it's certainly for me in my first pass kind of naive sense of what does self-organising mean, and what are some of these kind of organisational design systems where just plot people in and it will all
focus on the work and everything else will take care of itself. And you're like going, in theory that's all right, but in practice, we're not. It's like in economics, like being the rational economic man. You're like going, in models, brilliant. Yeah. In real life, not so.
And I think there's almost a double risk for organisations, or if you're looking at how, we have these organisational challenges, or we're designing an organisation, and this is stuff we're bad at. Maybe we're bad at get real buy into vision or something, and then you just pick a system to do it. I think you could end up in a worse position than if you had just tried to double down on some of your existing people management. So I think there's many roads. Being really clear about the outcomes, the problem you're trying to solve, and evaluating on that basis is really important, because actually there's lots of emotional intelligence and leadership and guidance. There's all these sorts of things. I haven't seen any way you're going to get around needing them, and not just swapping model. If you don't have it within your organisation, all the model swapping in the world isn't going to fix that.
Yeah. And I also think that the other thing that you kind of said, which was interesting, was that when you take this type of system and you have everybody wholly sort of focused on the work, you can end up becoming really internally focused, and you lose sight of kind of some of the stuff that's going on the outside. I mean, is that your experience, and how have you combated kind of that? Because I think the thing we were talking about before, and I was thinking, that made me think when you talk about systems thinking, and I shared a document with you around sort of Stafford Beer's viable sort of systems model, and how he had articulated that the intelligence function that links, if you like, leadership with the external environment and then feeds back into the operating kind of system that you have that delivers the work to clients and whoever, it's almost like essential to keep everything relevant and keep everything evolving. How have you, what have you experienced that, and how have you dealt with that, as it were?
Yeah, I think it. And I'm certainly not an expert on all of the, on self-organising teams in general, to be honest, or any of the specific models. So this is more from my experience.
Yeah, of course.
A structured criticism. But I think certainly in our approach, what I found was that we, as you go through different organisational sizes, I guess the role of whether it's innovation or leadership or scaling, there's some really subtle jobs that are being done that I think if you flatten everything, you can remove the organisation's ability to kind of see, communicate quickly and act potentially, because I haven't seen a democratic model that I would say that I believe in as from an organisational, that is organisationally effective, for example, so that everyone should be kind of all equally hearing and seeing and then endlessly putting things to a vote. I don't have any experience, or I haven't read about anything in a commercial context where that's been effective or scalable. I'm sure it can work in some situations, but not in we want to grow and kind of scale perhaps beyond 5 people or something. So I think the kind of really recognising that there's that that kind of strategic awareness, that being able to make decisions quickly, being able to kind of analyse, and I think some of that can kind of be lost when it feels like it should be a peer-to-peer or very kind of democratic or kind of flat structure, that actually recognising that having the ability, particularly as a small organisation, because it's a competitive advantage over very large organisations, to be able to kind of see, interpret, internalise and do is something that's incredibly powerful, and understanding that those are all discrete functions that have huge value, I think is really important when you look at some of these systems, because you may end up feeling like you're just a kind of peer facilitator if you were perhaps the creator of the organisation or someone who is determining direction. If you lose your ability to communicate and set that, then I think it's really important to understand how that would continue to happen in your new model, because it's one of the more complex things to.
Because I mean, it reminded me of the so my own experiences. I worked for Shell and Shell and I did some work around sort of corporate intelligence, and got involved in some of the scenario kind of planning stuff and innovation sort of stuff, and it seems to be that they're a company that's been around for a long time, and it serves them well in terms of the horizon scanning and planning for the future, looking further out than the 5-year corporate plan, or whatever it might be. And I guess it also becomes one of the things that when companies get under pressure, it's a thing that seems to add the least amount of value in a sort of an annual kind of quarterly reporting kind of cycle, this sort of like future radar type of thing, and therefore it can be the thing that gets kind of cut, but then people kind of cut that and then lose sense of what value it adds and how it keeps you evolving on. And it seems to me that there's this thing around, actually there's a quest to move towards a better organisational structure that fits better within our economic and societal kind of context, but actually there are things to be learnt and incorporated that come from more traditional companies that have a longevity, and so don't throw the baby out with the bathwater type stuff, like this kind of corporate sense-making intelligence sort of element, and then into a more flexible sort of thing. And so I find that's something that I find really, really interesting, because there is this, like you've said before, is like a purist approach where people go, it has to be like this, but it's almost like, in your experience, and not necessarily from a theoretical perspective, we're just talking about it from an experiential perspective, in your experience, that there are deficiencies in reality when you incorporate some of these kind of models.
Certainly, and I think examining, if you're the person evaluating or motivated to make some of these changes within your organisation, I think really examining your own motivations for what benefit are you looking for personally? Is it something about your role, or is it something about the organisation that you don't like? And really examining, is this the most effective way to kind of address this? And also looking at what layer are we looking to create autonomy or innovation, or like what benefit? Is it just that I believe philosophically that all organisations should run this way, or am I examining the organisation in the context to look at what benefits are we trying to gain, and then use that to evaluate what model might be appropriate and how would these benefit be realised, and what is possibly your personal bias about the role of the leadership team or the function. And certainly if it feels like a kind of night and day shift, it may be that some of your biggest gains could be gained fairly easily by increasing kind of buy-in and vision, or working in a more agile, just literally in a delivery way rather than an organisational structure way. So there's a lot of nuance or context, I think, about where you can apply some of these principles and techniques, rather than we are entirely purely this or nothing. Sometimes I'm sure maybe it is the right thing to do, but I think you can lose the detail and the vision a bit if you're not careful.
Yeah, almost have to kind of make sure that we don't go looking for the answer. Which is a general kind of human trait, that we look for the answer, like, tell me what to do and we'll go do that, and then everything will be fine. But there's actually, what you're saying is, there isn't really an answer. It's like a journey. You just got to keep going and figure out what works for you and why it should work for you, and it might be in a limited or a whole kind of way, but it's like you've just got to keep experimenting, figuring out, and then focusing on, and also focusing on outcomes, the right outcomes, rather than just thinking, if we move to the structure, it'll be the be all and end all. Yeah,
and it would be difficult to understand how you're delivering, because there's layers of change happening within any organisation, of the environment you're operating within, the team culture, the commercial performance, that if you're not kind of understanding the benefits that you want, then you really will have a bad job of determining. We had lots of change happening at the same time. We were growing and we were changing organisational structure. The market was changing around us. Without kind of maintaining a view of those sorts of things, there's a risk you also deem yourself a failure for actually what was a success of implementation, but maybe in a commercial context was more challenging. So all of these models have pros and cons, and that I think selecting which sets of pros and cons you're most willing to live with or are most appropriate to your goals is the right way to go.
And so, just back to brass tacks, I mean, how has this move impacted your clients and what you've been able to deliver your clients? I mean, is it that you've seen a shift? I mean, yes, you've grown, so it can't be that much of a drag on what you're doing, but how have your clients kind of benefited? Is it like you're doing better work, doing more work, doing more innovative work, they're happier? Kind of what's been the outcome on that side?
So we extend the transparency principle to clients. So we work with them in a software delivery sense, we work with them in an agile way, and in a communication and collaboration sense, that kind of follows through. So they have complete visibility of our working practices. We use Slack as our kind of internal messaging platform. They are on Slack working with us, for example. So we find clients are compatible or incompatible in some ways with that approach. We find the more experienced the client, the more they realise that there will always be difficulties and challenges on projects, but you're better off working with people who stand side by side with you on that stuff, rather than people where it's the kind of it's a perfect, amazing project until 2 weeks before the end, and then it's suddenly very not that thing. So we I guess apply those. We kind of I guess support the team in working with those principles, and we bring them into the kind of practice that we do as much as possible with clients.
Okay, and here's another sort of brass tacks kind of one, I guess, is that this all seems very fashionable these days. Why is that? I mean, is there a real reason, or is it just it's fashionable?
I think there's a mix of things going on. I think we go through waves and trends. I mean, there's been nods or different formats of this. I mean, my first inspiration that I can remember was reading about Ricardo Semler doing this in the 70s in a fridge factory in Brazil, for example.
He's a hero. Yes. Maverick is just the mind-blowing book. If you haven't read it, people should totally read it and then read it again.
It's just a great. It's a great. It's a good story basically of what this can kind of feel like, and I think it is. There's, like all stories, it has its kind of blind spots, but it's a great one to kind of get a feel from, and also to have it be, see it be done at scale, absolutely. And I think also kind of tech and communication, both tech companies and what people want from the workplace. I think certainly we're evolving the kind of concept of employment rights and the expectations of what people have in a competitive, certainly believe in tech, but because it's more competitive, companies work harder at delivering a better experience to their employees. And I think if you look at sectors where that isn't true, I don't think you see these things happening. So I think there's a drive to think differently and do differently, but there's also a very real kind of imperative in a way that these people have a choice, and by creating a company that gives them the very best holistic kind of experience, that will be a competitive advantage, because I don't see this happening in coal mining or places where there just isn't really kind of employment pressure.
Yeah, and it sort of it adds weight to that sort of idea that without a great or competitive employee experience, you can't really deliver a great customer or client experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the two things balance the equation.
Yeah.
Anyways.
And I think people do believe in these principles, and I think they are very effective, but I think there has to be an explanation for why, as humans, we haven't hugely changed in the hundreds of years that there's been employment, for example. So why now are we moving to some of these models? And I think there's insight, but there's also there's commercial imperatives that are also driving some of this stuff. And if it didn't work, it wouldn't continue to be done either.
Sure. And so if somebody wanted to, say, follow in your footsteps, I mean, what's the first thing you recommend them do, to prepare for it? Because there has to be a preparation of sorts. So what would you say to them?
Yeah, I think there's a mix of I think trying to go and talk to people and read some case studies and do a little bit of theory, but do a lot more hearing some war stories, I guess, because I think it will help you understand better what your context is and what you're actually doing with it, I guess. So I think there's some kind of great theories. I think reinventing organisations by, I think it's Frederick Laloux, for example. It's the kind of, it's the problem is, I guess it's a bit of a textbook. It's the classic, this is a very pure model and this is a very kind of theoretical thing. I think the risk of those sorts of books, they're great to kind of get the big picture. The risk of them is that they're difficult to relate to, and therefore your blind spots and your kind of insight into your own context it doesn't necessarily develop, and that's going to be one of your kind of key needs, I guess, in kind of implementation. And I think also examining those motivations and where your organisation stands now. So doing that kind of health check, looking at how far are we away from this today, and what does that mean maybe at an ownership level within the company, within a leadership team level within the company, and also within the kind of the wider organisation. So that kind of that situational awareness piece of like, where do we want to get to, why do we want to get there, where are we now, and what does that journey look like, and trying to just look at each of those individual pieces as clearly as you can, I guess.
Yeah, I think I would definitely recommend having a look at the Frederick Laloux's Reinventing Organisations book, but it is quite dense. I think the workbook that accompanies it is probably more helpful because it's a bit more practical and asking more questions and get people to do stuff, and therefore it's more contextual. It's better for individual circumstances rather than just being a textbook. But if people were kind of saying, well, rather than it just being a fashion or meme type of thing, we should do this and it can become another fad, is there any kind of like signals that, or things that people might be feeling or frustrated with, that would signal that you might want to think about this? From these are some of the challenges, or these are the things that we're butting up against, because some people might just be butting up against it and actually not necessarily know, like we don't know kind of what the options are, if we don't know what the options are, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what sort of signals do you think, what sort of things that might they be encountering or feeling?
I think certainly engagement. So if you feel that if you're in a senior role and you feel that people don't really understand what you're trying to do or don't really seem to care about where you're trying to go, then I think this, looking at it from a kind of intrinsic motivation and a self-organising perspective, will challenge your practice and your context to understand how you could be more effective, I guess, at engaging people and, ultimately inspiring them to some extent. So starting to look at kind of what are the symptoms of where there's no autonomy within a context, or there's a lack of the vision being communicated, or you can start to look at kind of classic, kind of very hierarchical or very the opposite. I start to look at some of the attributes of what's the opposite of self-organising, and saying, if I'm really honest, in the cold light of day, do we hold some of these attributes as an organisation? And certainly if we do, if there's a lack of transparency, then that can lead to a lack of buy-in or a lack of trust. Mm-hmm. Do we have some of the symptoms of those sorts of things? And then I think even in your own personal practice, because I think for some people you may be in a management role where there's a lot of people above you and there's a lot of people below you, and it's not your choice to how are we going to implement self-organising teams as an entire organisation. But I firmly believe you can implement a lot of these principles even within a 5 or 10 person team that you operate within. If you look at some of the kind of agile practices from a delivery perspective, the Agile Manifesto, mm-hmm. Or look at how do I personally operate within my kind of work context, and I think you can start to get some kind of senses of what kind of gains or losses am I making in terms of how I choose to practice.
I think the reference to the Agile Manifesto is a really interesting one because the thing I really like about the Agile Manifesto is that it flips the focus away from structure and systems and process to actual kind of outcomes, and kind of doing how you work together, what you focus on, how you work with clients, the things that you focus on sort of fixing. So it is very much more benefit and outcome kind of based, rather than going, this is the way that we do it sort of thing. And so that's it's a great piece of advice. But before, so I've got a couple of other questions that I want to ask before we sort of bring this to a close. But is there anything else that we've missed that you think that if people are considering this or want to know more about it, that you think that we've missed out, that you kind of think, actually, you should also think about this before you can move on?
Just something you just said actually gave me the idea around, I think the manifesto is a great way, it's the great antidote to the textbook approach to this kind of stuff, and writing your own kind of organisational practice manifesto and actually forcing yourself to go, these are principles, because it's only principles that you can really share kind of cleanly and clearly. And if you can't agree on your kind of 10 commandments of what defines us as how do we get things done as an organisation, that's kind of a great place to start, I think, that you can do as a workshop with your leadership team in an hour.
Yeah.
If you can't get there, then don't read into page 400 of some of these kind of organisational design books, because that's almost where you can start in a way. This really is about principles, and I think the simplification, keeping it simple and keeping it kind of those as your kind of guiding principles, is actually what allows you to engage effectively with what's quite complex in a way, because then you can keep working out what's right for you and make those decisions in your context, rather than there's a risk you can over-refer to models or over-refer to other people's implementations, and the risk is that they may or may not be relevant, and that could obviously be problematic.
Yeah, absolutely. So my two final questions. My penultimate question is a piece of ongoing market research I've been conducting, because I wrote a book last year called How to Wow, and what I've been doing ever since it got published in April last year, everybody I've spoken to on these interviews, I've asked them for their perspective on what wow service or experience means for them. So I'd be really interested to hear kind of your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think for me, it's when an organisation wows me is when they understand my needs in a way that even I didn't really understand them. It's living inside your customer's skin, and it's what they can't articulate, what they don't ask for, but what you anticipate or what you have the insight to understand about them, that then you can deliver. That's when you give that wow service, because you're giving above what's just been asked for. You're not delivering, this is what, we've agreed this in a contractual sense, I want this, you've given it to me, that's the end. It's when you can, and that's how I believe you do deliver great products and great services, is you go and live in that world and understand really what they care about, often to a level which people can't necessarily articulate or see themselves.
Excellent. And that brings me to my final question, and so that I always ask, and that is there anything you like to shamelessly plug, Tim?
So my kind of something I'm
quick out the blocks.
Yeah.
Quick out the blocks.
I didn't even know this question was coming, but I'm glad I've got
ready.
So more a kind of something that there's a new thing that I'm working on really, which is looking at it's a new venture called Green Shoot Labs, which is how do we, looking at some of these future of work and self-organising team trends, and also looking at business messaging platforms like Slack or Facebook at Work. How do we take advantage of these these kind of new platforms, but keep this human-centered design kind of principle, that they are beneficial additions to the workplace, and that things like Slack aren't just the new inbox hell, basically. So we're looking at how do you cultivate a sense of empathy or engagement within an organisation, and help these platforms benefit from those principles, I guess, rather than they could actually be corrosive towards them.
And that's greenshootlabs.com?
Yes, it is, yeah.
Fantastic. We'll make sure to get that all linked up and give you guys a big sort of shout out on that. But Tim, thank you very much for sharing your time and experience kind of with us. It's been ace.
No, absolute pleasure. I could talk about this stuff all day, as you can tell. So yeah, thank you very much.